Good evening. Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and it's lovely to see faces that we don't see in the World Arts Centre very often, so I'm very happy to welcome you here. My name is Marianne Bourchex-Laporte. I'm the curator of this project, of which the speaker series, which Geoff is the first speaker of, marks the beginning tonight. So I've been very fortunate to be able to develop the project Collective Walks, Spaces of Contestation, Art, Activism, and the City as part of a curatorial residency at Unit Pit Projects, which is an artist-run center on Pender Street in Chinatown. So Unit Pit is presenting the project tonight, but we are also co-presenting the talk series with the SFU Vancouver Office of Community Engagement and with the SFU Institute for the Humanities. So I would like to thank Johal and Samir Gindesha for their help and involvement in the project. So this project is researching the aesthetic and conceptual overlap existing between strategies for participatory performance and activist self-organized demonstrations. The end product of the project, if you will consist in the presentation of 4 site-specific performances that will happen in March and April 2014 that will be realized between the collaboration of 4 Vancouver-based artists, Gabriel Mindel-Salomon, Didier Morelli, Lauren Marsden, and the Unlearning Weekenders Collective, which is constituted of Catherine Gros and Zoe Cray. And each artist is working in collaboration with a community organization, either in Vancouver or in Burnaby, in order to realize these projects. So all of the information about that is on the Unit Pit website. But the speaker series that we're starting tonight is meant to provide a theoretical and conceptual underpinning for the project, and to try to breach the gap existing between art activities, activism, and academia. So hopefully we can start to tie all of these together through the speaker series and then through the project. So I'd like to introduce to you Geoff Mann, who is the first speaker of the series. Thank you very much for accepting to do this. And I understand that you're a little bit out of your comfort zone. He said he won't talk too much about economy, but please do ask him questions about it afterwards if you're so inclined. So Geoff Mann is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the director of the Center for Global Political Economy at SFU. His research focuses on macroeconomic governance in the affluent global north, especially the ways in which monetary and fiscal policy affect and are affected by economic and ecological crises, and their relationship to the range of social arrangements we call democracy. He is the author of Disassembly Required, a field guide to actually existing capitalism, published in 2013, and Our Daily Bread, Wages, Workers, and the Political Economy of the American West, published in 2008. And before passing it over to you, I just want to introduce the next talk of the series, which will be held just across the hall at Studio D, and it's Jamie Peck, who is also an economic geographer who works out of UBC, who will be speaking. So that's at 7 p.m. November 12th. And if you are interested, there's another event tomorrow night presented by the SFU Vancouver Office of Community Engagement that looks at similar issues of gentrification and the such. It is called, it's the screening of the documentary film Zipper, about gentrification of Coney Island, and it's at 7 p.m. tomorrow night in the cinema here on the 3rd floor. So thank you, Geoff. There'll be a question and answer period after.
Thanks. Okay, I've been told I have to speak through the mic, which is going to be tough, because it means you can't move. I understand now why the rock stars have the one that they hold, so they can move around. But I'm going to do my best to be as animated as one can be standing still. And I also wanted to ask a favor, actually. Matt, sorry, this sounds so weird to have a conversation with a friend in the back of the hall, but Michelle and the boys are going to show up, and so I was wondering if you could make sure they have seats. Is that possible? Right on. Thanks a lot. That's my partner and my sons who are forced to come to this after soccer practice. So there you go. The life in the city, hey? Okay, so my talk is entitled Scarcity Makes the City. And I'm hopefully going to remember to change the slides at the appropriate time. I have them in bold and everything on my talk, but I sometimes forget. So if a slide doesn't match, just go with it. But I'd like to thank you all for coming. There's so many faces in the room that I know, which makes me feel really comfortable and a lot less nervous. And I'd also really like to thank Marianne for asking me to be involved and for putting all of this together. And the rest of it's going to be great. And I'm really hoping, or I'm guessing actually, that most of you didn't know Jamie Peck was the second speaker, because if you were going to pick an economic geographer to come listen to, it probably wouldn't have been me. But now you're here and I've got you. Okay. And also, yes, there's questions afterwards. Feel free, if something's really burning when I'm talking, just maybe interrupt or something, I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so since we are here to think about the city and how and why it changes over space and time, I wanted to start here with a few facts about urban space-time. These facts are about as grounded as anything I could think up. Where we are and where I live. This actually isn't what I was talking about, but it's a pretty cool photo. This is a car that drove off the first Georgia Street Viaduct in 1929. I love the photo. It says something classic about Vancouver. At any rate, here we go. So, here we are right now. Or at least here is what here was where we are. This is Hastings and Cambie, looking west in 1938. It looks different, certainly, but then, in other ways, it is immediately recognizable, I think. Some things have changed, but much of it's pretty similar, at least in terms of the built environment. Here is where I live. This is my neighborhood. Okay, 100 years ago, but it's where I live. I live just south of the intersection of Commercial Drive and 12th Avenue. Just about half a block from Trout Lake. And this is Trout Lake almost exactly a century ago. In those days, its most notable contribution to Vancouver's everyday life was not as the invaluable public space it provides today, but as the source of power via water for the Hastings Mill, probably the first industrial engine in the city, which was about 3 miles away at the foot of Dunleavy Avenue on the shores of the Burrard Inlet. Now, clearly, some things have changed since this photo was taken. The Hastings Mill is long gone, and Trout Lake looks pretty different now, but not that different. If you go to this spot today, which is just to the left of the beach at the south end of the lake, for those of you who know the park, especially on one of those really crappy March days where you're like the only one out there, and it's really grim, it's not like you would never be able to imagine that this is the same spot. Well, the only thing that actually makes me think that that's not the case is that it's hard to imagine that bird poo-filled lake ever powered a timber mill. But other than that, I just want to look really briefly at a few other changes in my neighborhood, which is also the neighborhood of many of the people in the room I know. So this is 2nd Avenue and Commercial in 1927, looking north. Now you can see one of the most notable things that's not there anymore is the trolleys, which dominated Vancouver's urban landscape until the mid-1950s when the tracks were torn up. In fact, here is the same intersection in 1954, and it's actually at the very moment, the reason that the barriers are up there is because the tracks are being torn up. So they're taking the trolleys and streetcars away from Vancouver and putting in buses that are powered by electricity that we know today. Here is the same corner today. Different, but not radically different. Some of the same buildings are there. I don't know what the buildings are called, but the one with the red burrito is always in there. Here is the intersection of 20th Avenue and Commercial Street, just near Lord Selkirk School, for those of you who know the neighborhood, in 1913, exactly 100 years ago today. Now, aside from the fact that things actually don't look all that different today, a little bit for sure, but you could recognize it. One thing I did want to point out here, though, is, I can't tell if you can see, but see, this is where I can't turn around, look at the side, my slide's not good enough. Okay, so there are banks on the corner. This is going to come up later. There are banks on the corners. The Bank of Hamilton on the left, the Bank of Hamilton no longer exists, and you can't see it very well, but the Bank of Vancouver is on the right. It existed for 5 years. It was in the boom of a financial explosion that happened just before the First World War began. And the Bank of Hamilton was swallowed up by the Royal Bank of Canada in the mid-1920s, when most of the banks in Canada disappeared. We went from 35 to 11. A time of great financial consolidation, one with which we should be familiar today. Oh, really? I'm like Tina Turner. Okay. Now, I think it's really interesting how in some ways, even though lots of things are so different, a lot of these photos show a real continuity. Looking at them, you can see some of the same buildings still in use, and in some cases even for the same purposes. There is much, I think, that you can connect to the neighborhood that you wander around today. Some things, however, have changed a lot more noticeably. This is the alley on the west side of Commercial at 3rd in 1934. It's the delivery and production side of the Crystal Dairy, which stood on Commercial Drive at that location for almost 40 years, before real estate prices and regulation drove dairies outside the city limits. This is that same location today. That's pretty different. Hard to deny. Here is more such change, and actually this is the photo that I loved the most. I don't know why. But this is also my neighborhood. It's about 150 feet from where my door is right now. It's in the same year as the Trout Lake picture, 1908. And this is the corner, if you can call it that, of 14th and Commercial. Some things have changed a lot. This is the Buffalo Grocery, and I can't zoom in the photo, but it's covered in plug tobacco ads. And it's right across the street from what was then called Buffalo Park, which we now know as Clark Park, which sits between Knight and Commercial between 14th and 15th Avenues. Clark Park was donated to the city in 1889 by a real estate magnate and dry goods man named E.J. Clark, hence Clark Park, in the hope that the development along Park Avenue, which is now called Commercial, would make him rich. And partly it did. He didn't live to see it, but Clark Park did help bring the city south. Here's the same corner today. Of course, it wasn't only Clark Park that opened up Grandview to development, certainly. There was lots going on. Timber to be cut, the contingent decisions of intrepid business people heading over to the east side, a strategically placed interurban rail system, and more. It all mattered, along, of course, with a colonial ideology that could not understand the land as anything other than there for the taking. Land, it seemed, that its indigenous inhabitants weren't using to its full potential, and had therefore no right to claim as their own. But I think one of the things that we have to think about when we're looking at photos like this and thinking of history this way is not to read the expansion of Vancouver, sorry, this thing is really weirding me out, as the mere unintended consequence of a series of pioneers hacking their homesteads out of the woods. That may be the way it seems if we get distracted by the many individual acts through which the city comes to be. But the forces that help determine the scope and form of these actions are far more complex and, to be honest, for lack of a better term, structural. They are deeper, I think, more fundamental, more total in a sense, more a part of history itself. And among other things, one thing that most of these forces that created modern Vancouver shared, including E.J. Clark's gift to the city of 7.5 acres, was a drive for profit, for growth, and for the creation of more industry, more production, more goods, more people, and more money. This is, and has always been, since settler colonial people arrived, a thoroughly capitalist city. Now, I want to note at the outset that in pointing out the essential role of more, and in what follows from here on out, I am in no way trying to say that capitalism is about greed. I hear that a lot from social justice-y folks of all stripes. But capitalism is not about greed, or it's no more about greed than any other way that humans have organized their collective life over time, or almost any other way. In fact, I don't think there's any reason to believe that capitalist greed is any worse than the greed of, say, Louis XVI, or Henry VIII, or Julius Caesar, or Stalin. What distinguishes capitalism's more is not greed, but it's that in capitalism, the more is an imperative to the system. Profit is the gauge of success, and competition is the mechanism by which success or failure is translated into growth or collapse. All individual enterprises must strive for higher and higher profits to facilitate the accumulation of greater and greater capital. If they fall behind, they either go under or get swallowed up. This search for increased profit translates, at the scale of the whole economy, into the necessity of economic growth, what we know today. Stability in capitalism is synonymous with growth. In other words, if accumulation, growth, and the more stops, capitalism itself stops. This is the first mode of production in history that's like that. This is the reason I think that all this more is the kind of thing that many of us associate with capitalist growth. For lots of people, capitalism equals growth, a kind of constant more by definition. I too would argue that this imperative to growth or accumulation is indeed a fundamental aspect of capitalist development, so much so that growth and development are actually used in economics interchangeably, even though if you think about it, the ideas are actually pretty different, growth and development. It's also true, certainly, that this imperative is a central player in the production of the city's built environment. This history of capitalism, especially maybe of Vancouver capitalism, tells us that the built environment is one of the most, and sometimes the most, important means by which capital is accumulated. It has proven an endlessly attractive target for investment, as we know. Which means, interestingly, that the built environment is both a signal means through which the city advances into the future, and perhaps the most influential factor in creating what we might call the city's hidden histories, its past, or at least so far as those histories leave material traces. Capitalism's constant need to uproot, to reconfigure, to rejig, redesign, and expand. What often goes by the name of creative destruction, a term coined about a century ago, is also and always simultaneously a disappearing of what was. This is a home at Georgia and Jervis, 1957. Georgia and Jervis looks really different than this house now. In laying out this story, one of the things I really want to be careful of, to avoid, is attributing all urban change to capital. But I would say that, at least since the arrival of settler colonialism, it's clear that change in a changing Vancouver always has a capitalist character. The fascination that most of us feel in any meander through the city's archives is born to a significant extent, I think, of the discovery of a city that once was, and that modern capitalist urbanism constantly rejigs and revamps and even destroys. Geographers have a term for this, spatial displacement, or the spatial fix. But my point, even though I'm a geographer, is just to flag the almost entirely forgettable obviousness of what spatial displacement does in the city. Even the past here is a product of capitalist dynamics, because it is the constant erasure of the city that was that produces what we call the city's history. Norman Klein has written a great book about Los Angeles called The History of Forgetting, but it could just as easily have been written about Vancouver. Here, for example, is Hogans Alley. Many of you, I believe, have heard of this. It was the heart of Vancouver's small but vibrant black community during the first half of the 20th century. The alley was a busy spot back in the day, but this community was displaced by rapid urban change, changing in the railway industry where many of the people worked, and other developments, and the construction of the second Georgia Street Viaduct effectively killed it off. Speaking of other hidden histories, here is the 2nd Avenue Temple at 1866 West 2nd Avenue, so right at Cypress. This was the first Sikh temple in North America and stood for 62 years on land that is now occupied by another one of those ugly low-rise buildings that cover kits. When it was constructed, actually, it would have sat right on the edge of the Kitsilano Indian Reservation, which was slowly appropriated by the city for building the Burrard Street Bridge, among other things. Founded by newly arrived Sikh laborers in the first decade of the 20th century, the temple was the center of a thriving community until a new temple was constructed in South Van in 1970, and real estate prices effectively prevented any growth in the site at the second, as the Sikh community moved south and out of the city. Now, I couldn't resist putting this in, but here, too, is a somewhat related bit of forgotten history in Vancouver. This is a 1925 meeting of the Imperial Council at the Imperial Palace of the Canadian with a K, I'm not kidding, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Vancouver's KKK which at one point numbered as many as 3,000 members, was not a group of disgruntled workers angered at their displacement. It was actually made up mostly of the city's elites, formed by racists and some leftovers of the infamous Asiatic Exclusion League. The local KKK targeted immigrants and non-whites in the interwar period throughout Vancouver. In some cases, that involved kidnapping and beating. It was led, among others, by A Peyton, the mayor of Marpole at the time. Now, Peyton went on to a long and distinguished career as the Conservative representative in Victoria for Point Grey, and he was one of the main forces behind Japanese internment. The palace in the heart of Shaughnessy is now Canuck Place. Crazy, hey? World is a crazy place. And just so we don't get too relaxed about the pastness of this past, this is Hastings in 1982. So we're not done with this yet. Anyway. Now, the relation of these changes to Vancouver and the histories they obscure might seem to be related to capitalism mostly in quite a general way. They are embedded in the capitalist city and cannot help be affected just by that fact. But there are also more what you might call classic or stereotypical examples of the way capitalism shapes Vancouver as a city, and the ways those histories and memories have been erased. Take, for example, Vancouver's place in the great labor unrest that shook the whole west coast of North America in the 1920s and 1930s. The most famous of these confrontations took place right here, actually very close to here, at Ballantine Pier in June 1935. The story actually is in many ways typical of labor-capital conflict at the time. The first Longshoremen's Union, the International Longshoremen's Association, was crushed by the Shipping Federation in 1923, and they set up a company union in its place, which eventually became independent enough that by 1935 they were again challenging the employers. At the height of the tension in 1935, the Shipping Federation locked out workers at Powell River. Pretty soon, every longshore worker on the west coast was involved, of Canada, in the lower mainland especially in the conflict, and workers on the Vancouver docks refused to unload the ships that non-union workers had loaded and manned on their way down the coast to Vancouver. The Federation then brought in non-union workers to work the Vancouver docks. I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with this, but on the 18th of June, 1935, more than 1,000 workers marched through what they then called the East End, what we would now call Strathcona and Railtown, to Ballantine Pier, which still sits at the foot of Heatley Avenue in Strathcona. They were met there not only by management, but by hundreds of armed policemen, private security, and the RCMP. And some reports later claimed that there were snipers on the roofs. Whether that's true or not, when the marchers tried to force their way past the guards to protest the non-union workers, they were set upon with a viciousness that surprised people even at the time when police felt far freer to swing their clubs. For 3 hours, police on horseback chased the strikers and clubbed them and beat them. One fleeing longshoreman was shot in the back of his legs, and at least in a couple of cases, strikers were chased right up onto the porch of their houses by the police and beaten. The Union Hall was tear-gassed, as was the first aid station set up by some of the wives of the workers. This is a woman berating the police as they chase the strikers down. Now, my point is not only, of course, that this is an example of the ways in which labor relations at the heart of capitalism shape the contours of urban life in Vancouver and every other city. This is of course part of it, but I also want to emphasize the way in which capitalist economic development, growth, the drive for more, helps shape the city and the neighborhoods and workplaces it contains, and shape the social life of Vancouver in both blandly everyday ways, but also in really dramatic ways like this. Capitalism not only helped create the Vancouver in which the Battle of Ballantine Pier, as it's now known, took place, but it also helped create the city in which the Battle of Ballantine Pier is forgotten. The city's past, and thus its present also, are created and obscured by capitalist development. This is what it looks like when you look over toward Ballantine Pier today. It's another world. Mechanization means far, far fewer people work on the docks anymore. Cranes and containerization and massive capital investment on a global scale have produced an astounding example of what economists calmly call capital labor substitution. In what is now Strathcona and Railtown, the working class neighborhoods and the taverns and the bawdy houses of port towns all over the world are gone. And the ports themselves are fortresses, securitized and inaccessible, even if you were to bother to cross the chained-off tracks and overpasses and fences that try to reach them. Seen from the water, Vancouver has transformed perhaps even more shockingly than it has from the land, which is hard to imagine. This is capitalism, and this is how it makes and grows the city. So this is False Creek in 1946. You can see how differently shaped False Creek is, aside from the relative lack of urban development. Here we are in 1980. Things have changed a fair bit, of course, but this is pre-Expo. And here we are today. Now, all of this growth and change might lead one to think, and it seems to me that a lot of people do think this, that what capitalism is really about, or at least what it could really be about, perhaps if it were unfettered or free or something like that, what it could really be about is abundance. Capitalism certainly stands as the most astoundingly productive model of economic organization the planet has yet developed, at least if we judge in terms of stuff produced. There is more stuff on the planet right now than there's ever been. There's so much stuff that if our great-grandparents came back tomorrow, they would be flabbergasted. Mostly I'm saying that because I love the opportunity to use the word flabbergasted. And yet, this is not abundance. And it is not abundance because there's a distributional kernel in the idea of abundance that we all know, I think, even though it's not in the dictionary there when we look for it. If we see astounding wealth in a community, but it's mostly in the hands of a few, I think it's very unlikely we would call that abundant. We might say vast or jaw-dropping or ginormous or something like that. But abundant implies that there's enough for everyone. It's right there, I think, in the feel of the word. Now, I am not particularly wise, but there is one truth with a capital T that I think I'm going to try and pass on tonight, and that is that there's no such thing as capitalist abundance. Scarcity is capital's watchword, the ground on which it operates. That is why, as I hope you will agree when I'm finished, scarcity makes the city. Well, some will tell you that that ground, scarcity, is nature or natural. Scarcity is a fact of life or the way the world works or an uncomfortable reality. None of that is necessarily true. None. And anyone who tells you that there is capitalist abundance, in other words, a capitalist way of organizing society so that there's enough for everyone, enough to go round, is wrong. Maybe they don't know they're wrong. Maybe they're just naive or unreasonably hopeful. Maybe they're lying. But they're wrong. Capitalist abundance in this sense, which is surely the only sense that matters, enough to go round, is impossible. It's not unlikely, it's not rare, and it's not difficult. It's impossible. It's an impossibility written into the DNA of capital. And I'm going to try and show why. And that's because capitalism doesn't confront scarcity, it produces scarcity. I'm going to spend the rest of my time trying to explain why that is and how that affects the lives that we live in everyday ways right here. What I want to say is that while capitalist development is obviously constrained or limited by geography, in a kind of bland ways, like there's a reason we don't build factories on the top of mountains, it is capital's complex relationship to scarcity that actively makes and unmakes the spaces and places in which it unfolds. And because these are the spaces and places in which we live and work and play and think and act, this scarcity, these capital-formed worlds, determine in a not at all minor way precisely the ways in which we think and act and play and work. And I think it's fair to say that, unfortunately, for the most part, most of us think and act and play and work as if the world were defined by scarcity. Now, this is a live question. It's all around us every day here in Vancouver and everywhere else. And it presents opportunities, obstacles, and complicated mixes between the two. I believe wholeheartedly that things can be otherwise. And some of the seeds of the otherwise are already there in the ground. We just need to nurture them. They won't fix everything, of course, but they are good places to start. Before we get to the relationship between scarcity and capitalism specifically, though, I want to do a little bit of legwork. One of the more notable features of most explicit discussions of capitalism, like this one, and there are more and more of them today, which I think is interesting, is that most don't really explain what capitalism is, like what its key parts are, how it actually works.
it seems more often than not that it's kind of like a you know it when you see it sort of concept. I don't think that's good enough. So just for a little bit, I want to take some time to think, at least in a general way, about how capitalism works and how it came to be. So this is more up there just to be like something to look at. But I did want to put it up there because it's a fascinating piece of history. This is the first dollar produced by that Bank of Vancouver that existed for just 5 years. So in 1910, it produced this dollar, or what is it, $5? $5. Produced this bill. And it recently sold for $177,000 to some collector, whatever. But I bring it up here actually because one of the things that people often don't know about the history of capitalism is that what we think of as standard money, minted by the government or produced by the government, actually in Canada is a fairly recent evolution. Canada didn't produce its own money that generally circulated everywhere and dominated until 1935. Prior to that, banks produced their own money, and that's what you used. And when you wanted to cash it in, you had to go back to that bank. So when you had this Bank of Vancouver dollar, you could use it at a business if they were willing to do business with the Bank of Vancouver, and then they would return to the Bank of Vancouver and make the deposit. So there were many, many, many monies, and overcoming that inefficiency was one of the great achievements of modern central banking. That's a total aside, I apologize. I was starting to get into where I'm comfy. But at any rate, moving on to capitalism, or back to capitalism. I may be the gazillionth person in the last 2 centuries to point this out, but when you look around today, one of the first things you notice, I think, is the glaring or even shocking differences in different people's opportunities to accumulate wealth and hence enjoy a secure and happy life. These differences depend, it seems to me, primarily on what people have to do to put food on the table. Virtually everyone has some capacity to contribute labor to producing things of value, things we can use or exchange with others that they will value. But relatively few people in the world today have both the capacity to labor and own the stuff that you need to mix with labor to make the things that circulate. Natural resources, tools, factories, those things that you mix your labor with to produce. I might have all the skill and energy in the world, but without a hammer, without nails and some wire, I can't build a fence. And you might be the best chef around, but without a kitchen and food, your hands are useless. These things that help us produce things, including the money to purchase them, have therefore a special status, rightly so. They are the magic things that, mixed with labor, turn valuable raw materials into even more valuable finished goods. This special relation is what defines them as capital, and it's what defines as capitalists those few who today own them. Now, one of the most important questions in history, I think, is why there are capitalists at all. Why doesn't everyone have, or at least have access to, those things that enable you to produce things for use or exchange? How did the capitalists get to be the ones with all the tools and resources? I would argue that this is one of those moments when history matters in the present to an extraordinary extent. It is one of those problems that brings to mind that famous quote from William Faulkner, who said, as many of you will know, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. Because how we answer this question, how did the capitalists get to be the ones with all the tools and resources, is the basis of how we judge the justice of modern life in the city and beyond. Our answer to this question, I think, is crucial because it tells us how we should understand the world which is clearly so good for a fortunate minority and so hard for so many. And as you can imagine, precisely because the question is so important, oh geez, sorry. No laughing, this is a non-laughing matter. Precisely because the question is so important, there are a whole host of answers to it. Some of them basically attribute it all to what you might call good luck. In the historical and geographical gamble that is human life, some people came out on top and some people didn't. This is basically, I've just given you a précis of guns, germs, and steel right there. That's Jared Diamond. Good luck. Huh. That's all right. Others have suggested everything in life is some sort of Darwinist survival of the fittest game, and that those on top deserve to be there. It seems to me that the fact that we don't all start at the same place and therefore have the chance to make ourselves the fittest makes this argument so ridiculous it's incomprehensible, but it's nonetheless quite powerful. Another one along these lines is that there is some natural right that falls to the first appropriators. If you mix your labor with something that no one else owns, like the soil, then, according to this, you get to own it. This is how capitalists got to be capitalists, because they were the ones who bothered to mix their labor while everyone else stood around waiting to be told what to do. This is at root the argument that was used and is still used to justify the expropriation of First Nations in North America. These kinds of arguments are essentially meant to tell us that there's nothing wrong with the devastating inequality in which we live, or at least there's nothing wrong that has anything to do with us, or anything that we can change. There is, however, a more accurate story, at least if the word accurate means matches up with real history. This is that wherever capital goes, capitalists and capitalism arise through a series of dispossessions and expropriation. This is the history of Vancouver, for sure. Here is the Kitsilano Indian Reservation, as I mentioned earlier, and there's the right-of-way that was expropriated to build the Burrard Street Bridge. The rest of the reservation slowly fell away over time. Now, by forcefully asserting an individualized and comprehensive property right over what had been collective resources, enclosing common land or appropriating raw materials, these resources, which we've just defined as capital, become concentrated in the hands of a few. This leaves the expropriated with no means of getting by on their own. To survive, they have no choice but to find a way to get access to these resources, to what we now call capital, which are also, it turns out, the means of putting food on the table. This is another photo of the Kitsilano Indian Reservation at the same time, 1935. Now, one of the most important conclusions we can take from this historical analysis is that capital can only exist in relation to labor. Original appropriation by the few from the rest not only meant the emergence of capital as a social group, but it also of wage laborers, of the everyday kind of work that we are familiar with today. This is the Musqueam Nation marching on Grandview Bridge in 2009. This is because, once dispossessed, the many can get access to capital, the resources necessary to put food on the table, only by offering their capacity to work to the capitalists in return for payment of some form. They sell their energy, their skills, and time for wages on what we call the labor market. And capitalists use this labor power in combination with capital to produce commodities for market exchange. Now, I should note here that commodities are, by definition, things produced for market exchange. If you grow lettuce in your garden to put in your salad, that's not a commodity. A commodity is produced for sale on the market. And by selling commodities for more than it costs to produce them, capitalist profit is made possible. Now, this is admittedly a pretty general account. You may very well have a whole host of examples running through your head that contradict it in large or small ways. It is certainly true, of course, that capitalism does not look the same everywhere you go. Societies have their own ways of doing things, and they adapt capitalism to their needs, and they become adapted to it. China, for example, has a very complicated and evolving relationship with capitalism, and it's probably not even throughout that whole nation. But I think it's reasonable to say that all these dimensions of capitalism are essential to modern political economic life, at least for those of us who live in the affluent part of the world. But if there is a first among equals of these features of capitalism, it has got to be profit-seeking via market exchange. Now, we don't think a lot about it, but markets are the answer to the distributional question in capitalism. Now, I know that sounds a bit strange, perhaps, but markets are how things get allocated to specific groups of people and places in capitalism. Goods and services don't get spread around by, say, ethical rules of thumb or traditional tributary relationships or according to some planner king. In capitalism, things are distributed via markets. Those with the ability and willingness to pay get the stuff. In capitalism, if you don't have the money or the willingness to pay, you don't get the stuff. So markets are the means of distribution. Now, if you're the one producing for the market, it only makes sense to do so if there's a positive difference between what it costs you to produce and the kinds of revenues you're going to bring in when you sell it. This difference is the profit, of course. And it is clearly only possible in a situation in which other people need or want what you're selling. In other words, it means they don't have enough of it already. If they did, they wouldn't be buying. Here is where we get to the inescapable scarcity at the heart of capitalism. It is driven by the imperative to grow, to accumulate, the more I mentioned earlier. This accumulation is only possible if we can obtain the more via production and sale. But there will be no sale if there's enough already. I want to take this a little further, but it's worth pausing, I think, at this moment to underline exactly what this means. It means that if there is enough for everyone, if there is enough to satisfy people's needs and wants, capitalism can't work. There has to be not enough. There has to be scarcity. Capitalism is anti-abundance by definition. Now, often when I make this argument, people respond with a proposition that goes something like, yes, but can't we have a capitalism that meets people's needs in an adequate way, and all the profit-driven market competition happens with their wants that exceed those needs, what we might consider luxury? Couldn't capitalism, for example, produce enough food for everybody and then have the market competition revolve around the preferences that one might have for that food, like, say, avocados versus artichokes? They would compete. But this oversimplification, which seems to me even more pie-in-the-sky utopian than most anti-capitalist dreamlands, misses the point, which is that scarcity is what makes capitalism tick. It's not something we can produce our way out of, or if we did, we wouldn't be capitalist anymore. The best way to see this, I think, is to look at one of the most important markets of all, the so-called labor market. Let's take one of the key goals of post-World War II social democracy, what used to be called full employment, a condition in which everyone who wanted a job would have one. Now, after the disaster of the Depression in the 1930s, virtually every country in the affluent global north put together something like full employment legislation, in which the state committed to providing good work for all who wanted it. Now, much of the legislation, as you can imagine, ended up pretty toothless. And full employment has since faded into one of those unrealistic expectations that workers just can't seem to get over. But there are a couple of really interesting and instructive aspects that we can learn from the whole idea of full employment. First, and I don't intend to go into the details here, but we can certainly talk about it later, modern economics, for the most part, assumes that if a market economy was perfectly free and prices and people adapted to the reality of the situation, then full employment would happen naturally. The idea is basically the following. If you have a whole suite of commodities in an economy, then if you let the prices rise, or fall to the point at which everything supplied finds a buyer, then there will be no idle resources. Does that make sense? So the argument is that here's the argument. If I want to sell this, and I say, I'd like $100 for this, and you're all like, you're out of your freaking mind, I'm not giving you $100 for that. And I say, okay, 99. And eventually I find myself down and I say, okay, I'll give it away for half a cent. And somebody's like, oh yeah, Keith's like, I'll buy that for half a cent. So if prices would adjust for everything that's out in the economy, then it would always find a buyer. It's just a question of how low the price has to go. Does that make sense? If this were the case, then everything offered on the market would find a buyer, and we would have full employment of all available resources. This is supposed to be also true, of course, of the labor market. Any desire to keep wages up on the part of workers by things like minimum wages are distortions that prevent this market equilibrium from being reached. This is the fundamental core of modern neoclassical economics. If this were ever to happen, it's called a situation in which all markets clear. In other words, everything that goes in comes out one side. Everything goes in the supply side, comes out the demand side. Does that make sense? This is the justification, as I said, for things like, this is the justification for the sort of constant opposition to things like minimum wage, which are supposed to create a situation in which some workers are making too much, which prevents other workers from entering the labor market, as if there was a certain amount of money available for wages in the market that gets used up by the few, and then the others are left to stand on the side. This is the reasoning that goes behind the vast majority of economic policy in Canada and elsewhere. The second thing about full employment is that it has been long held up, especially by the labor movement, as a panacea that could somehow solve capitalism's evils while remaining capitalist. If only everyone who wanted a job had one, then not only would everyone be better off, but all those workers would be consumers. And they would purchase all the things that provided the profitability to make the system work. In fact, I know he's a weird-looking dude, isn't he? That's John Maynard Keynes. And in fact, this assertion is commonly understood to be the heart of something called Keynesianism, which is a mode of economic regulation mostly associated with the work and thought of this guy here, John Maynard Keynes, a Brit. He has had an enormous, and many of you have probably heard of him, profound effect on modern economic thinking and policy for the last 80 years. Keynesianism, at least as it's generally understood, not necessarily how he understood it, suggests that the best way to solve capitalism's problems, the ones that arise when there is not enough demand for all the stuff that capitalists produce, is to make sure there is money in people's hands, which they will then spend on that stuff. The plan, so the idea goes, is that if there's enough money out there in the hands of demanders, we should get a situation in which the economy is firing on all engines, using up all its resources, a full employment like we were talking about. A virtuous circle of production, wages, profit, and consumption that would create a dreamland like we've always heard was possible. The problem, however, is that it really is a dreamland. If a capitalist society ever reached the condition of full employment, we would be in big, big trouble. Indeed, it was Keynes himself who pointed this out in clearer terms than anyone before him. His argument in what I think is the unfortunately neglected part of his book that is so famous, it's called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. There's a reason not many people have read it. He argues there that capitalism only works if it actually produces scarcity and misery. Without them, capitalism stops working. And here he is. This is my one academic quote. I apologize. It'll be over soon. If we start from a position of full employment, entrepreneurs will necessarily make losses if they continue to offer employment on a scale which will utilize the whole of the existing stock of capital. Here's the good part. Hence, the stock of capital and the level of employment will have to shrink until the community becomes so impoverished that saving becomes zero. A society under conditions of laissez-faire, in other words, free markets, will be one in which employment is low enough and the standard of living sufficiently miserable for everything to work. Thus, this scarcity in the labor market, not enough jobs for all who want them, not enough to go round, has to be produced, and Keynes shows very clearly how capitalism produces it. Despite a whole apparatus of state and capital funding of research into the natural rate of unemployment today, there is no such thing as natural unemployment. Unemployment is not natural. It has to be produced. Real full employment would be a catastrophe for capitalism. Scarcity is absolutely essential, even in this most central of markets. Consequently, scarcity has a kind of double role to play in capitalist drama. On the one hand, it is posited as the natural condition in which we live, right? It is therefore, sorry, I hate it when people do that, right? I take that back. On the one hand, it is posited as the natural condition in which we live, and it is therefore the condition against which capital supposedly struggles constantly. Indeed, a classic definition of economics is that it is the study of the distribution of scarce goods amongst competing uses. And at least, according to capitalist accounts, that's why capitalism came to save us, because it fights against the darkness of scarcity. But then, at the same time, it's capitalism that produces the very scarcity against which it is supposedly arrayed. It is capitalism that must constantly seek out a shortfall, an insufficiency, and where it does not find one, it must create one. It must create shortage, not enoughness. And when this is impossible, it's forced to seek out new scarcities in spaces and markets elsewhere, where scarcity can again be reproduced. We can see the repercussions of this in our lives everywhere, I would argue. When capital confronts a situation of abundance, it absolutely has to either destroy that abundance, create a new scarcity, or both. Think about a situation in which firms produce so much stuff that the market becomes overfull, and prices, and therefore profit, drop. In that situation, which we classically would call overproduction, all of a sudden the whole point is to stop producing for long enough until there's scarcity again, because scarcity is the fundamental precondition for profit. Interestingly enough, this is precisely, of course, when the state steps in. The state, especially as Keynes imagined it, is the key manager of the inevitable scarcity that always plagues capitalism, either through something like the wheat board here in Canada, which keeps prices up by suppressing production, or organizations like OPEC, which control oil supply to keep a price high, or via the bank bailouts that we just watched and the asset purchases. The state often comes to the rescue when capitalism inadvertently provides too much of something. The big problem, however, is that if you need scarcity to make the system work, you also have to live with it. And yet, While a lot of people might require scarcity to make their fortunes, not a lot of people want to live with it. In general, then, the experience of scarcity is not at all evenly distributed. Capitalism allocates to some groups far more scarcity than it does to others. You can see this kind of scarcity at work everywhere in the city. Take the mobility of capital inside and out, in and out of the built environment, the spatial displacement and constant destruction and creation of the modern city, that the modern city experiences. When we see Vancouver as a product of the legacies of capital accumulation, growth, and competition, which it certainly to a significant extent is, if not entirely, when we see its histories living and dead as a product of that dynamic, we get to the heart of what it is about the modern city that is essentially capitalist. Capital has to move to grow. In other words, if you take your savings and shove them under your mattress, that's not capital, because that's not growing. And the built environment in the city is a particularly useful means to keep capital moving. First, because it's defined to an extraordinary extent by private property relations. Private property is the rule in capitalist cities. No matter how property is originally accumulated, there is almost nothing that can challenge the nature of property rights in the city. What this means is that urban land is scarce by definition. By definition, urban land is scarce. If it weren't, we wouldn't even think of it as urban land. Scarcity is a fundamental quality of the capitalist city. I don't know how many of you have been watching this go up. This is that building in what I call the fast food central beside Main and First, you know, where Wendy's and Burger King and everything is. And there's that crazy building with the craziest scaffolding that's been going up there. I think it's called Central. At any rate, this is a photo of it. I think it's quite fascinating. The second feature I want to point out here around the built environment is that elements of the built environment are inseparable from the land on which they stand. But because of the centrality to capitalism of profit in the context of competition, increasing returns to investment in the built environment are key. This drives not only the abandonment we see in some parts of the city, but also the renewal, which we often experience as gentrification. Third, the built environment in the city is for the most part a long-term investment. This means finance capital in the form of banks and other financial institutions is almost always involved. In fact, the modern city I would argue, would be absolutely impossible without the capitalist monetary system, which provides an elastic and readily available private supply of credit, without which urban investment on the modern scale would be impossible. Housing, of course, which is probably what many of you have had in your mind the whole time, is a closely related issue in which this plays a crucial role. Why isn't there affordable housing, or why isn't there adequate affordable housing? Lots of reasons, I suppose. Weak policies, uninterested enforcement, corruption at the city. But the principal underlying reason, I would argue, is capitalism. The whole idea of an adequate supply of houses that everyone could afford makes no sense in our current system. There can be no capitalist real estate market where there's enough housing to go round. If that happened, the whole kit and caboodle would go into crisis. In fact, I think you could look at the recent real estate-backed mortgage crisis in the United States as being in one way just another way in which capitalism got rid of a whole bunch of housing inventory without having to give it away to people who might use it. We can't give the houses away. That would defeat the purpose in capitalism. We have to create enough misery again. No, so to approach a closing at last, which hopefully many of you aren't desperate for, but maybe, I would just like to turn very briefly to what all of this might suggest on the question, or in some cases the problem, of art. One of the principal themes of the series, which as you know is called Spaces of Contestation, Art, Activism in the City. Now, all of the examples I'm about to draw on are from Ken Lum, a local artist who's no longer local in the sense that he lives in Philadelphia, but this is on the Art Museum in Rotterdam, and I love this image. Let me flag, though, if it wasn't already glaringly obvious, that I am neither an artist nor a very knowledgeable art critic. I am kind of a I like art guy. My knowledge doesn't go very far beyond that. But in thinking of scarcity and the way in which it has made and continues to make the city today, it seems worth mentioning what might be pretty obvious to many of the more art-focused folks in the room. Art, and actually I precisely mean public art, the kind of art that Marianne is interested in, It breaks the scarcity rules. Public art is in its very existence a rejection of scarcity. It seems a bit much to say it's something like abundance materialized, which sounds a little hokey. But there's definitely something there. It is truly a public good. Now, unsurprisingly, in conventional orthodox economics in which I was trained, public goods have always been a bit of a bother, theoretically and empirically. No market was ever going to supply a public good because there's no money to be made in them. They can't be scarce. They're a public good. The obvious rebuke they provide to a world that is supposed to be defined by scarcity has long presented some really tricky problems for conventional economics. Nevertheless, their struggle with the idea has produced some really useful ideas. This is right where we are during the construction period, I believe. Again, Ken Lum. In economics, a public good is defined as something for which consumption is both non-excludable and non-rival. Now, if people are feeling bored even by that phrase, let me explain what that means. A public good is non-excludable and non-rival means it's a good that is both impossible to exclude non-paying users from using. So, for example, clean air. I can produce a whole bunch of clean air, but I can't stop Marianne from breathing it. It's non-excludable. And a public good is also non-rival, which means that no matter how much I use, there's still lots left for everyone else. Does that make sense? So, the classic example in the literature is a clean stream that I drink from, but unless you can imagine millions and billions of people coming to drink from the stream, then no matter how many sips I take from the river, there's still lots left for everyone else. So a public good is non-excludable and non-rival. There's always enough for everyone. What could be less capitalist than that? Public art, at least in the most general sense, captures this better than anything else I can think of in the city. Sometimes I think, though, that that artistic moment is fleeting, perhaps even unintended, captured by those lucky or unlucky enough to be there. Something maybe not even meant to be art or artistic, perhaps. This is an incredibly poignant slide. It's a picture of a doorway to a Japanese business the day after internment. And the owner, before he was rounded up or she was rounded up and sent to the interior, posted on their door, as a last act, a copy of their thank you from the Queen for purchasing war bonds in the Canadian war effort. And it wasn't meant as art, but in lots of important ways, it is art, I think. Other times, it's definitely art with a capital A, even if it's short-lived. And I am thinking, and actually particularly struck by, the passage, the physical passage of another work by Ken Lum, From Shangri-La to Shangri-La, from a highly visible location next to the Shangri-La Hotel here downtown during the Olympics, to a beautiful but very out-of-the-way park on North Shore. It's still public art, but somehow it feels less public. But it's a powerful piece of work. Here it is where it was originally situated, and here it is where it is now. In fact, I went with a few students there just the other day, and if you don't focus on the scale, the houses are about this high, it actually looks like you could walk right in them. It's a really amazing place. It's at the Maplewood Flats Conservation Area on the Dollarton Highway, for those of you. There's a Tim Hortons right nearby. But at any rate, just to close, in all such moments, during the moments when public art's publicness is most visible, most vibrant, it is defiantly anti-scarcity. It is basically an infinite and unstoppable experience machine. It's an unusual thing in this world. Because what it does is it's always more than enough to everybody. And there's great hope in that. Thank you.